Good evening. My name is Karen Newrohr, and I'm the coordinator for Science Cafe. Welcome to our first Science Cafe of this semester. This is a great turnout tonight. I want to begin by thanking the library ambassadors who are helping us tonight. Wendy Law Wong, Tiana Kozusak, and Enda Merkel, and their advisor, Dr. Marshall Fulgham. Thank you, ladies. This Science Cafe is sponsored by the OSU Library, the OSU Vice President for Research, Dr. Kenneth Sewell, and the OSU chapter of Sigma Xi Scientific Research Society. And one of our Sigma Xi officers is here tonight, Dr. Udiah De Silva. Yes, thank you. Refreshments are courtesy of the Vice President for Research and the Friends of the OSU Library. At this time, I will recognize the student organizations who partnered with us for this Science Cafe tonight. When I call your group's name, if you'll just raise your hand real quick, that'll be good, and then we'll applause at the end. So, I have the names here. So, Ag Economics Grad Student Association, anyone here from there? Okay, I see a few. Great, thank you. Aggie X Club. Okay, I see one back there. Alpha Kappa Delta International Sociology Honor Society. I see some hands. Great. Good. Thank you. College of Arts and Sciences Student Council. Okay, there's one or two. The Farm Theory Club. Okay, excellent. Thank you. The Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. Anyone here? Okay. Oh, they're here. Okay, great, thank you. The Plant and Soil Sciences Graduate Student Organization. Great, thank you. Sociology Club. Okay. And the Sociology Graduate Student Organization. Okay, excellent, thank you. These student organization partners help us spread the word about Science Cafe. So the program format tonight is as you see on the screen. We'll start with 3 trivia questions and some prizes. We will have our Science Cafe presentations, followed by some time for Q&A. And then at the closing, we will ask you to complete the evaluation forms on the tables, and then we'll have some announcements, and we will draw for some door prizes at the end. So my speakers tonight are going to help me watch hands for these trivia question door prizes, and let me grab them. Let me go ahead and introduce our speakers tonight. Our first speaker will be Dr. Bailey Norwood. He is the Barry Pollard MD P&K Equipment Incorporated Professor in the OSU Department of Agricultural Economics. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Ag Econ from Clemson University, a Master of Science in Ag Econ from Kansas State University, and his PhD is in Economics from North Carolina State University. His research interests focus on consumer preferences for food. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Tamara Mix. She is the Lawrence L. and Georgia Ina Dresser Professor in Rural Sociology in the OSU Department of Sociology. Dr. Mix holds a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from James Madison University, and her Master of Arts and her PhD in Sociology are both from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Her research interests are environmental sociology, environmental justice, social movements, social justice, race, class, and gender inequality. So let's go ahead and thank our speakers in advance here for coming tonight. Okay, so the question will be on the screen, and we're going to watch for hands to go up, and then after someone says the correct answer, then we will award the prize. So here's the first trivia question. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Agriculture regulate bioengineered plants and animals. What government agency assesses genetically engineered food? Yes? Which stands for? No. FDA is correct. Yes. Yes. The correct answer is the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. They assess all genetically engineered foods to make sure they are safe before allowing them to be sold. Okay, here we go. Second trivia question. Genetically engineered foods are assessed for safety for four things. 2 are humans and animals. What are the other 2? Yes? No, those aren't the answers. Okay, we'll do one more. Yes, back here? Yes, that's correct. The other 2 are plants and the environment. Okay, we have one more. Name the 3 main genetically engineered crops grown in the United States. Yes. Yes, I think that's correct. Cotton, corn, and soybeans are the main GE crops grown in the United States. Most of these are used to make ingredients for other foods, as you can see on the screen there. And all of these questions came from Medline Plus, which is a government organization. Okay. Okay, we're ready for our first.
Thank you. Great trivia questions. Thank you. And let me have my speech there. Well, thank you so much for coming. GMOs certainly bring a really good crowd. It's like clickbait, you know. It's controversial. People like it. And especially thank you to all the professors who made your students come here tonight, yeah, whether it be extra credit or sheer force. Yeah, I was talking to 2 of my students earlier, and when they saw it was 2 of us here, they thought maybe it was going to be a debate between Dr. Mix and I. It's nothing like that, but I can see why you think like that, because almost every time you see a documentary on GMOs, a presentation on GMOs, it's usually making a fierceful argument for or a fierceful argument against. The person's usually either saying we need GMOs to feed a growing population, or they're saying GMOs are going to kill the population. Well, this is going to be if that's what you're used to, this is going to be very different. Dr. Mix and I, we're less interested in us coming out and saying whether GMOs are unambiguously good or unambiguously bad. What we find particularly interesting is how two equally smart and equally kind people can form radically different notions about GMOs, very different opinions, even sometimes people with very similar backgrounds. Dr. Mix and I, we're finishing a book called Meet the Food Radicals, where we interviewed 27 people who are either currently radically changing agriculture, say through new technologies, or are proposing radical new ways of producing food, or a new food system, a new way of eating food. So these are very interesting, fascinating people. But of those 27 people, whenever you talk to them about their vision for the future of food, GMOs almost always comes up, and they often disagree. Sometimes they're very much for, sometimes they're very much against. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to try to help you understand why GMOs are so controversial in the first place, why it is that very smart people from similar backgrounds can end up having different opinions about GMOs. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to first give you my description of what a GMO is and how I believe scientists tend to think about it, and how conventional farmers usually think about it. And then Dr. Mix is going to describe some of the other individuals that we've interviewed who are sometimes anti-GMO and their reasoning why. So to start with, if we're going to be talking about GMOs, genetically modified organisms, you know we're talking about genes, you know we're talking about DNA. And you can see I've got a picture of a DNA strand right there. And that's what DNA looks like. And as you all know, DNA is a blueprint for how an organism is built. Just like when someone building a house, they start with a blueprint of a house. The blueprint says how it should be built. Your DNA says how you should be built. And when I'm looking at this audience, this is probably the most attractive, beautiful audience I've ever seen in my life. And it's not, and the reason is because that's how your DNA is. Your DNA said, this person will be beautiful, and behold, here you are, beautiful. Okay. And what I'm going to actually show you some DNA here. This doesn't help very much. You know, it doesn't tell us about the information in DNA. But, you know, if you know the structure of DNA, inside that DNA strand is nucleotides, and there's only 4 nucleotides in DNA, and it's the sequence at which those nucleotides appear in a DNA that has its information. And so there's only 4 nucleotides. We tend to just call them by letters, G, C, A, and T. And all that matters is that the sequence in which they appear in a DNA. And I'm going to actually show you some DNA. So you can see I have some letters up here. That's from the DNA of S Aureus Bacteria. And so it's a sequence of T's and C's and A's and G's, and it's those sequences that say, build me an S Aureus bacteria. But of course, we know there's a lot more letters than that in its DNA. I actually have the whole thing right here. This is the entire DNA of the S Aureus bacteria. Okay? It's the whole thing. Like if you look, like people here, what letters do you see? C-A-G-T, in really, really small letters. And this is big, right? But this is the whole thing. This is the blueprint for this bacteria. I once, to see how far it would go, I once spread it on the football stadium here in Boone Pickens Stadium and went 45 yards long. And of course, your DNA is much bigger. If Dr. Silver, you have your exact DNA, don't you? Didn't you get your sequence? Well, so Dr. Silver, he has his copy. He's got his copy, probably on a computer file. And if we printed it out in the same font, on the same paper, and spread it out, it would actually go 45,000 yards long. And so we're more complex. No wonder we can't agree on GMOs. We're just too complex to do that. And so no matter what we're talking about, if it's living, it's this DNA, it's these sequences of these letters that matter. And so if we have a plant and we want to make that plant more valuable to us, we want to change its DNA. We want to change those letters in a way that makes the plant a little more useful to us. And I'm going to go over some of the ways we do that because you can't really understand what a GMO is unless you understand the other ways in which we also change these genes, change these letters. And the one way we've mostly changed the DNA of our plants, I'm mainly going to talk about plants here, but the same goes for animals, is through natural genetic mutations that occur in nature and selective breeding. And so what we have here, you have modern corn on the left, corn that you've seen before. You know, this is what corn looks like. You all know corn. You know what the corn plant is. Well, corn is not a natural plant. It didn't start in the wild. Its ancestor is this plant called teosinte right there. It's a plant, and I grew, this is me and my daughter in my garden. I grew teosinte because I wanted to see what it looked like. And those are actually 3 teosinte plants together, not one big one. So you can tell modern corn and its ancestor, they look alike in many ways, but they're also very different. For instance, modern corn looks like this. The ear of a teosinte looks like this. I mean, consider this. This is where corn started. This is where it ended up. And what happened was people were eating teosinte, but it's not a very useful plant. It's got a really hard case to it. It's hard to digest. It's hard to make into flour. But then one day, long before we knew what DNA was, there was a natural genetic mutation in a teosinte. And any one gene has about a 0.0055% chance of mutating just naturally. And so mutations, any one gene has a small probability mutating, but over a long period of time, when you consider how many genes there are, and a gene is just a certain sequence of letters, we're going to have some mutations. And one day, this little teeny teosinte ear had a mutation that made it a little easier to eat. Its outer shell wasn't so hard. It was easier to digest and easier to make into flour. And when people noticed this, they said, we like this better. Let's plant the seeds from that plant. And then over time, some of these ears would get, there would be a mutation in one of them, and maybe this one plant started producing a slightly bigger ear, and you could get more seeds from it. People said, okay, what we want to do there, I like having more seeds than less, so we're going to plant the seeds from that teosinte. And so you start getting all these little changes, natural genetic mutations and selective breeding causes all those little letters to start changing. And they change and change and change, and over time you get corn. And corn is, of course, not just one thing. These are different types of corn I grew in my garden. We have blue corn, red corn, and there's even a glass gem corn that has every single color in it. And these corns are someone in your garden, you can create your own different colors of corn just by deciding which plants of corn to breed. So all that's happened without modern science, without knowing anything about DNA. And the same we can say the same thing for most of the foods we eat. There's a wild cabbage that grows on the cliffs of Western Europe, and through natural genetic mutations and selective breeding, some of those plants eventually became broccoli. Some of that wild cabbage became cauliflower. Some became kale. Some became cabbage. And so that's the history of where we get most of our foods. But, like I said, these natural mutations, they occur. But like I said, any one gene has a relatively low probability of mutating. This 0.00055% chance. And if we want to make more valuable plant varieties at a faster rate, really the only way we can do that, a good way to start changing those letters is to speed up that rate of mutation. And we've learned to do that as well. We take plants and we sometimes expose their DNA to radiation. And the radiation disturbs the DNA, the cells try to repair it, and it changes the sequence of letters that makes up a gene. It changes the gene. And so we deliberately expose DNA to radiation to cause mutations to get new plants. When you eat pasta, you're almost certainly eating a durum variety of wheat that was created through radiation-induced mutation. Now that is another way of changing the letters in DNA, but it is not a GMO. So even though we are altering the genes, it's not officially a genetically modified organism. Another way of speeding up the rate of these mutations is to expose the DNA to harsh chemicals, and the chemicals can cause mutations. There's a very popular line of wheat that we plant in Oklahoma that was created because of this. And so again, we significantly changed the genes in the wheat plant. We changed those letters, but it's not a GMO. And so that naturally asks, what is a GMO? This is a picture of a gene gun. It's going to be anticlimactic once it occurs, but there it went. Not a big deal. And it's going to continue to lube. You can see it shoot. What this is a way of taking a segment of DNA from one organism and shooting it into the DNA of another organism. So it's like we have these letters here, and I have a printout of a different organism's DNA, and it's like I cut some of those letters out and just shoved it in here. And so we take genes from one organism, put it into the DNA of a different organism. The different organism is the key, and that is a GMO. That is officially a GMO. It is just another way of changing those letters, but that is what we officially call a genetically modified organism. And there's other ways of doing it besides gene guns, but it's when you take like a gene from a bacteria and put it into a plant cell. So that's what a GMO is. And so when scientists look at GMOs, often they come away with this thought process. They say, well, we've been changing these genes all the time, long before we knew what DNA was. We've been changing genes through radiation-induced mutations. We've been changing genes through chemical-induced mutations. Here, we're doing it, say, with gene guns, and it's much, much more precise because we know how the genes are changing. You know, if we breed two plants together, we don't know exactly how the letters are going to rearrange, but with the gene gun, we have a much better idea. So a lot of scientists are going to look at this and say, well, this is just a really much more precise way of improving plants. And that makes it much easier to regulate, much easier to tell, say, if the plant is going to be harmful or not. And so when you look at it like that, you would tend to come away saying, well, these GMOs are no less dangerous, nor are they more dangerous than breeding a red corn with a white corn. Yeah, there are differences there, but it's still just a rearranging of the letters. And to most scientists, it matters less how you change the letters. What matters is what the new plant is like. And so, like, an analogy I like to use sometimes is consider you're sick and you can take medicine. Well, one way of finding medicine is a natural medicine. You know, maybe there's a plant that has certain qualities that can help you with your sickness. And you go and you just pick a leaf off the plant and you eat it. That's a very natural medicine. Another form of medicine is to take a pill produced by a multinational corporation that's produced in this big factory. Well, which one's better? We don't really have enough information to know, some scientists would say. They'd say, well, it matters less how the medicine was acquired. What matters is, does it work? And so that's how a lot of scientists are going to view GMOs. And most conventional farmers have a lot of trust in the regulatory system and the scientific agencies. And so they trust the process as well. Now, the funny thing about GMOs is that it's almost an antiquated debate. I mean, it brought a lot of people out here, but it's kind of a debate for the past because it's the old way of making plants. There's a new way called gene editing. And this is a really cool video. This is an actual gene editing taking place. This isn't an animation. It's a real video. A video wasn't taken with light, not with electromagnetic radiation, but something like an electron microscope, that kind of thing. And what it's showing is those little gray lines there. That's an actual DNA strand. That big bright blob, that's an enzyme. A very specific enzyme that scientists developed to find one very specific location of that DNA and cut it. And if you watch it, you'll see the DNA actually, there it goes, and it'll loop. You can see it again. That's DNA actually being cut. And that's gene editing. It's like if we went to this DNA right here and we were able to cut out whatever letters we want and put in whatever letters we want, without using the DNA of another organism. And this is even more precise way of modifying those letters, of changing genes. It's almost like you could took the DNA, put it in a Word document, and edit it like you would a paper. Very precise. And man, we're really changing some genes here, right? I mean, this is considerable modification of genes, but this is not, at least as yet, a GMO. This is not a genetically modified organism because no DNA was brought in from a different organism. Now, whether the definition of a GMO will change, that remains to be seen. We'll certainly be arguing about it, I'm sure, but currently the stance of the U.S. regulatory system is that things produced through this gene editing process is simply not a GMO. And so either this GMO debate is kind of antiquated, or the debate's going to change somewhat, and we'll just be arguing about it in a different way. So everything I've done there is trying to show you what a GMO is from, say, a physical scientist perspective, how scientists often think about it. And when I say scientists here, I'm almost always talking about physical scientists, chemists, molecular biologists, those kind of people. But there's also social scientists as well. And we all know GMOs involve far more than molecular biology. There's a lot more involved. And you can, in our people we've talked to, we've met some very, very smart people who are anti-GMO. And Dr. Mix is going to tell us a little bit about our conversations with them.
So Bailey has outlined a specific set of perspectives about GMOs, right, and genetic engineering. But there's so much more that's part of this conversation, right? We have feelings about manipulating life, and we have feelings about manipulating food, right? And all of that comes to play in the kinds of conversations we might have about GMOs and genetic modification, right? So maybe we feel a little nervous about fish genes being put in tomatoes to be able to allow the tomatoes to travel longer distances, right? And that's the original definition of a GMO, right? But maybe we feel okay with gene editing to be able to save the life of a child, right? There's a lot of values that are at play. There are a lot of feelings that are at play in these kinds of conversations. And we can talk about the sort of rhetorical debate of, you know, what is genetic modification, what isn't, and what's gene editing and gene manipulation. But it all comes down to if we're humans and we're using these strategies, we're going to have ideas and opinions, assessments, and feelings about them, right? So we've had the pleasure of meeting people with a wide variety of ideas, and I'm going to talk about some of them now. And so some of them make use of gene editing in their work. They rely on medicines that result from gene editing technology, or they make use of GM products on their farms. Others avoid those technologies at all costs and or work in countries that have made GMOs illegal, right? And they don't allow GMO or GM products in. But those that raise the issue with GMOs outline some common concerns, including things like a lack of research, frustrations or risks that arise when addressing GM issues, the role of corporate or governmental power in controlling our valuable food system, and then concerns for biodiversity as well as environmental impact. So they come to this conversation well-informed and with a lot of ideas about how genetic modifications can influence patterns of our lives and our social lives, right? So I want you to meet Liz. She's trained to seek some practical solutions to urgent problems and works in the development of new tools to genetically engineer algae, okay? Her work, she is aware of the controversies about genetic manipulation, and she's taught various academic summer classes, giving students hands-on experiences. So these are the same kinds of things you may have done in your own classes. So a GMO is introduced, what are the key stakeholders in that kind of conversation, what's going on in these kinds of debates, right? And so in the classes that are long enough, she would always have students come up with their own genetic modified organism, right? And solve some type of problem in the world. And then they had to go out and actually find what gene they would put in. And then they would have to figure out why they think it would work. And then she'd ask them to consider Who needs to approve this at the regulatory level? What kind of backlash or concerns might the public have? And how would a researcher address those? So she asks a lot of really good questions about the debate over genetic engineering. What do you have to do to make it happen? What is going on with this debate? So the solutions we're finding are not easy, right? She makes use of gene editing to address a lot of significant environmental problems. She uses them to address environmental pollution, global warming, health problems that are due to poor diet, animal suffering, and she's searching for a common solution. And particularly in her case, she's interested in reducing meat consumption. So she sees positive impacts of genetic engineering on solving social and environmental problems by creating meat made from plant substitutes, okay? And she argues it tastes just as good, and it's entirely possible to replace. Now, of course, ranchers and cattle farmers are probably not thrilled with this, right? But she believes that we can go ahead and use algae, genetically modified algae, to be able to create products that everybody would want to eat. How many of you would be willing to try it? Let's see a show of hands. Willing to give it a shot. Okay, I'm going to ask you a number of these kinds of things. I'll have you raise your hands a couple of different times. So we're seeing a rise in a new food culture. Perhaps it's even a more traditional kind of food culture, harkening back to when we got our hands dirty, when we were doing gardening, when we actually knew where our food came from. So for a while I was doing interviews with gardens in Tulsa, right? And there are some that have school gardens. And in those school gardens, I would ask the kids, so where do carrots come from? And they didn't really know. They're like, they come in packages, they're little, right? They're like those baby carrots, they have some water in there, right? They didn't realize that you actually pull carrots out of the ground and then package them that way, right? So we're losing that kind of connection to food. So this new food culture essentially is saying, hey, let's look at things a little bit differently. So the conventional food culture essentially went ahead and more often than not has been staying above the ground. They're rolling along in larger tractors. And the new food culture, they're going ahead and getting their hands a little bit more dirty than they were before in the garden. The conventional food culture was about mass production and middlemen. The new food culture is about connecting at farmers markets, being able to sell your product and having transactions with consumers. And the new culture also is likely to see connections between livestock and pets, right, which was not happening in conventional kinds of strategies. The new culture is also a little bit more modern. They are eating a more diverse set of foods, things like quinoa and amaranth. Do you know what that is? Okay, if not, look it up, taste it, see what it's about, right? So radical ideas are not just controversial because they're new, but because they involve an element of culture as well, right? And so a lot of what our folks are talking about is, hey, there's social dynamics and cultural dynamics to what we're talking about when we talk about food. So I want you to meet now Katie. And I'm not going to touch this anymore because they fly up individually, so I have to like slow down a little. Katie lives in an intentional community on campus, on her college campus, where she only ate local organic food. Katie is not against GMOs. She is diabetic and requires the insulin produced by genetically modified bacteria to live. So she says, I wouldn't say so much that I eat an anti-GMO diet as I eat a pro-community and regenerative agriculture-based diet. Katie and her intentional community want to make ethical choices and be in harmony with the environment. And she says, I feel powerless when it comes to addressing some of our larger ecological and social challenges. With food, I have more autonomy to pick something positive that I'm passionate about and excited about. For me, that means supporting local organic farmers, folks who are practicing diversified agriculture and making good care of the land. Katie tells a really important story about the nuances in the GMO debates. So, what's this? It's a banana. How many of you would love to have a banana right now? Okay. How many of you would eat a genetically modified banana? Okay. How many of you would eat a GMO banana if you were given $900 to do it? Okay, the same people raising hands. Any more people's changeovers? You're like, yeah, no, Matt, no, I might be willing to try it, right? So in 2014, Iowa State University made this offer via email to female students and staff between the ages of 18 and 24. But the big question was, is this GM banana safe? And to many scientists, as Bailey outlined, right, this was a foregone conclusion. Since the gene already exists in other bananas, that gene is beneficial to humans, inserting it into a different banana would only provide benefits, right? When the university made their offer, though, they weren't trying to determine if the banana was safe, but the extent to which beta-carotene produced by the banana would be converted to vitamin A in the human body to prevent blindness, primarily in children, right? A small group of Iowa State students, including Hannah and Rivka, saw the issues differently. They said they recognized that it would be the first ever institutional feeding trial of a genetically modified food, and they wanted to have a conversation about the implications. It turns out these bananas essentially were going to be grown at some point in time and provided for people that were living in Uganda, right? But what they found in terms of wanting to have a conversation about GMOs is that it was easier said than done. On their campus, talking about GMOs caused too much conflict. So keep that banana situation in mind, and I want to talk about Christina. So Christina studies food sovereignty in Venezuela. Food sovereignty is a people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So in an effort to promote agroecology and food sovereignty, the Venezuelan government passed a seed law in 2015 that bans genetically modified organisms from the country. The idea is that GMOs are designed to be used in conjunction with industrial inputs like pesticides. So Venezuela is trying to farm without such inputs. Also, they're trying to avoid what happened in Mexico when GMO corn unintentionally bred with local corn varieties, resulting in genetic contamination of local seed stocks. So a number of nations have passed policies limiting GMO use, offering local control and social justice as reasons to do so. So she talks about this idea of offering special protection to seeds developed by specific populations in order to promote greater agroecology and greater local control of production. So we can return again then to the United States, where we can meet Evan, who grew up on a small farm in west central Minnesota. And he says, I think all too often it's just two sides shouting at each other, unwilling to listen to the other side. So to the farming community in his area and the scientists he now works with as a PhD student, gene editing is a proven technology and a best hope for feeding a growing population. Evan embraces genetic engineering for the same reason that some people oppose it. With so many farmers adopting such similar seed from so few companies, some fear that we're losing plant diversity in agriculture. They argue that the conformity in plant genetics and the reliance on only a few large companies places our food supply in jeopardy. And should those crops prove vulnerable to large-scale pest infestations, like the fungus that ushered in the Irish potato famine, we would be in serious trouble. So while Evan looks to genetic engineering to increase plant diversity, others have made an effort to enhance diversity without the use of genetic technologies. So we're going to return again to this banana. Looks pretty similar to the other banana, right? This is actually the other one was just a regular Cavendish variety banana. This one is actually a genetically modified banana. It's modified so that you could actually eat the peel if you wanted to and get the vitamins from the peel without having that bitter taste. I don't know if you've ever, sometime, free time, take a bite out of a banana peel. You'll notice it's kind of bitter, makes your mouth feel kind of dry. This has been modified in a different kind of way. So I want to return to this banana. While students at Iowa State were trying to arrange a public conversation about GMOs before the feeding trial began on their campus, a policy advocate for the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa sent an open letter to the project funders and to the university in opposition to the feeding trial. The letter contained concern about GM crops not being proven safe and an argument about the complex role that vitamin A plays in human nutrition. Given the difference between the the diet and lifestyles of Ugandans compared to Americans, the policy advocates also argued that the experiment might prove little insight into how the banana would impact the health of Ugandans. Students in Iowa are different than people in Uganda, right, is what their argument was. This letter was publicly supported by 127 different organizations, many of them African, and 20 notable individuals. So there's people speaking out about the likelihood of this banana being introduced to the Ugandan environment. So here's where I was a little bit tricky, because those bananas in Uganda are not like those Cavendish varieties that we peel and eat on a regular basis that we love having access to, right? Ugandan bananas are not sweet like the Cavendish varieties that we usually eat. They're commonly referred to as matoke when they're cooked, and they're usually steamed, mashed, and eaten as a starch in many meals, much like cassava or potatoes, okay? And Ugandan children generally don't even like these bananas until they're usually 7 or older. And so if the goal is to improve nutrition in children by introducing a genetically modified banana, how will that work if young children don't even want to eat it? So there's a cultural dynamic that's emerging there. The letter that was written ends with a plea for Ugandan food sovereignty and for the protection of the genetics of staple crops. If better nutrition is the goal, greater variety should be encouraged, not genetic tampering with staple foods. Just so that you know, a recent update, in fall of 2017, permission was granted to do field testing of GM bananas in Uganda. So that pathway has been cleared. So when addressing GMOs and genetic engineering, those that express concerns often ascribe to something called the precautionary principle. And if you do environmental sociology, as I do, you're familiar with this idea. So activists like Hannah and Rivka argue that if there is a perceived risk, even if the percent that something could happen is low, you should do everything in your power to further minimize and avoid that risk. We're dealing with a very complex system that has chemical, biological, geological, and human components to them. We need to understand genetics in general and genetic co-applications far better than we do right now. So an interesting thing, too, is that European activists have been particularly clear about government adherence to the precautionary principle when it comes to genetic manipulation. And the principle has even found a home in Article 191 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is the international agreement forming the Constitution of the European Union. So the reticence of the European Union to adopt GMOs compared to the eagerness of the United States is important to consider for a number of reasons, and then also is partially due to the precautionary principle. So Hannah and Rivka say it well when they stress that in addressing the complexities of this issue, there should be an emphasis on research, outreach, and education, and people shouldn't be ashamed, and some are, of doing research on GMOs, and we shouldn't be splitting ourselves into these camps. Having these critical dialogues is important. Being able to talk about these issues is important. So we hope that we've given you some things to think about. This doesn't even address the full scope of the folks that we talked with during our interviews, but it gives you a taste of how very challenging and very complex this issue is. So from our talk tonight, hopefully you can see that smart, thoughtful people can have different assessments of GMOs and that the issue is really complicated. And we hope that we've opened up an opportunity for some very important dialogue on the complexities of genetic engineering and the roles that it plays within our food system. Thank you.
So the question was, do different countries classify GMOs differently? Like for instance, right now the US has said gene editing is not a GMO, and I think you're asking what will Europe say? And I'm not sure, I know my impression is that the U.S. has just recently made that determination. I haven't seen or read anything about what Europe is thinking. Do you know? Yeah. But I wouldn't be surprised if we came up with different definitions.
How much of our food that we eat right now is GMO?
Is GMO? So the question was, how much of the food that we eat right now is GMO? Well, if you eat meat, the animals that you're eating ate corn and soybeans that were almost certainly fed GMO feed. For other things that we eat directly, like rice or potatoes, I'm not sure what percent of those are. No wheat that you eat would be GMO. As far as the others, I'm not really sure. I couldn't say a percent. It's a good chance that if you're eating a Cavendish banana 5 years from now, it's only because of gene editing, because there's a virus about to wipe that whole variety of banana out. Do you have a question? Yes, sir.
As an environmental sociologist, I mean, so you mentioned in Mexico the corn sort of had genetic crosses with the other ones, and I mean we talk about how it may affect genetic diversity and it's sort of cautionary, but do we have any examples of where there might be some genetic crossovers or mixing with other native plants and that's harmful? Like what happens when that does happen?
Okay, so this is a complicated one. So the question is, what happens when GMO crops mix with traditional heirloom varieties, right? And there are concerns with the continuance of heirloom variety seed stocks if there is genetic contamination. And so there are a number of local cases where indigenous communities particularly have been very strict with sort of what's going on around. And we still even have some cases in the US with that happening too. Somebody says, I want to have an organic farm, but next to my farm is a farm that is using GM kinds of products, right? And this has been something that's still actually going through the court system in terms of who has rights and who doesn't have rights in that situation. But one of the challenges is you can't take back that modification once it happens. So the consequences are significant if you're working to protect heirloom seeds. Does that help?
Yeah, this question was sort of if we have any evidence of that being harmful to the environment.
This is one of the challenges again. So those that practice the precautionary principle say there are potential risks, right? Others say we're not sure because we're not sure what kinds of genetic modifications could be made unless we're able to look generations into the future to determine what the outcome is.
Andy?
I'm here for extra credit for ag policy. Policy question. Where do the two of you see the future of regulation heading towards GMOs in the United States?
So the question is, where do we see the future of regulation for GMOs heading in the United States?
I think it's going to really depend on how we respond to the gene editing. And I haven't seen any signs yet about how that's going to take shape. But I will say, we know two things will happen. That there will be a lot of money to be made from creating better plant varieties, and a lot of people will want to plant it. A lot of farmers will want to plant it. But as long as gene editing costs a lot of money, we can breed these things in your backyard, but you can't gene edit in your backyard. And as long as there are really big multinational corporations and very few of them doing this modification, I think there's still going to be a lot of resistance to it. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years now, we're not having the exact same debate that we're having now. Now, how policy changes to that, I don't know.
How are genetically
Question is, how are genetically modified crops regulated differently from genetically modified livestock? I don't feel I can answer that. I'm pretty sure it goes through the same basic regulatory process. Obviously, there's different scientists that have to be involved, but you remember at one of the quiz questions was about what are we protecting ourselves with GM foods, and one of those was we're protecting other plants. And if it's livestock, then I think you just replace plants with livestock.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a difference between the amount of chemicals used on GMO crops compared to non-GMO?
Okay.
Yeah, you can do that one.
The question was, and this could be really controversial, the question was, is there a difference in the amount of chemicals used on genetically modified crops versus non-genetically modified crops? There's certainly a difference, but how is it different? Here's one way to think about this. You remember how we said virtually all the corn, all the soybeans is genetically modified? One way they're genetically modified is that you can go, do y'all know this chemical Roundup? You can kill almost anything with it, right? And you go in your yard, you can write your name with Roundup. But if you go and spray that Roundup on a genetically modified soybean, a genetically modified corn, most of those, it won't hurt it at all. And so, and that Roundup, a chemical called glyphosate, it's now used a lot. And so we do use a lot of that chemical, but we're using a lot less of these other herbicides that we used to. And the active ingredient in Roundup is actually less lethal than caffeine on a per active ingredient basis. And so sometimes you get more, sometimes you get less. Most of the science I've read seems to suggest that the amount of harmful toxic chemicals has fallen because of GM crops. There's definitely some debate about this, but also consider that there's some GM corn that we used to spray, I think it was a chemical BT on it to keep insects from eating the corn. Now the corn makes its own BT. And so in one way, we're not spraying the chemical on it, but now the corn makes its own BT. And so it's complex, but I don't see anything to cause lots of alarm. I also haven't seen, we certainly also can't say that we don't have to use chemicals anymore. I know that's a nuanced answer, but.
So I have a question kind of about resistance. So the Roundup Ready corn, when you use it repetitively, are we seeing any resistance in secondary plants that we don't want growing in our fields?
Yeah. So the question there, and I see some heads shaking yes, there's some farmers in here. If we keep spraying Roundup on these genetically modified crops, will weeds eventually become resistant to it? And absolutely, and they are become resistant, and that's why if you know about the dicamba controversy in Arkansas, there's been some places where Roundup just doesn't work well enough anymore, so they're having to go to some other chemicals, and those other chemicals have some problems. They can drift really bad. And so, yeah, but the thing is, no matter what chemical you use, regardless of whether it's on a genetically modified crop or not, you always have that problem. You're always going to have a problem. Even if you try to manage weeds just through plowing and no chemicals, you're going to have some weeds that adapt to being disturbed by tilling. That will make even tilling less effective. Tilling meaning just like taking a hoe and digging weeds up.
Kind of a follow-up question to that. I know as she was saying that the sort of resistance is formed. I know that in the specific case of Roundup, it's like Bacillus thuringitis. Do scientists continue to look for new DNAs to edit in so that they can change the herbicide, or?
Oh, I think, okay, so you're asking, so we made a plant that can resist Roundup. Are they looking to make plants that can resist other herbicides as well? Absolutely, absolutely, and they've already made them. You remember when I said there was that? I said we can induce mutations through chemicals, and I said there was a popular Oklahoma variety of wheat that was chemically induced to mutate. That wheat is popular because you can apply a certain type of pesticide to it, and it doesn't kill the wheat crop. And so that was a way where it became resistant to a pesticide without even using genetic modification. So yeah, people are spending lots of money to try to do that.
You gave an example of how you might take a bit of genetic material from fish and insert it into the tomato. I guess my question has to do with our understanding of that genetic splicing process. When we go in and take some material from the fish, do we know what we're going to get when we put it in the tomato? Is it an absolute certainty, or is it more of an art where it takes 10, 100, 1,000 different trials before we create something that we actually like? And I guess the important issue there is there a danger that we might create something that we don't want that could be harmful, if it is more like an art?
So the question essentially is there some danger in creating something that we should be concerned about if we're genetically crossing different plants and animals together, right? And I think with this, and this is why I think this is the idea that people have mostly in their heads when you talk about GMOs, right? They're not thinking gene editing, they're not thinking about going in and removing particular parts, they're thinking about placing something that wouldn't initially have been there, right? And so in this case, it was an art, it was trial and error, and the intention was to create a skin on a tomato that would be durable enough to be able to, for long haul transport, right? And so if you're vegan, for example, you might not like the idea that you could have fish DNA in your vegetables, right? So some people are like, oh, I don't necessarily know about that, but some people are also like, well, that's sort of messing with things that I'm not really sure about. And so it has been a trial and error process with those kinds of things. And some of those things, some of them are not still on the market because there was an outcry related to them. But that also, in people's memory, left that idea of that's what a GMO is. It's this kind of mutation that creates something that we're uncertain of. Does that make sense? On there first.
I think so, yeah.
You talked about genes crossing over with genetically modified organisms crossing over with, say, an heirloom seed variety. But did anybody mention the economic impact on other people who are not growing GMO crops when their crops get crossed and then they can no longer sell the seeds from their crops and their entire livelihood is destroyed because of that?
So the question is, did anybody talk about economic factors that are related to genetic contamination in seed stocks? And to be honest, our conversations didn't go as in depth with GMOs as they did with other things, but that is certainly an issue that people are raising. So if you are intending to create heirloom varieties and you have that genetic material that has contaminated your crops, it does then, it's no longer marketable, right? And so that's why many nations, particularly in the global south, have made some strategic choices. Some of them do feel that they're okay with relying on GM products, and others are saying, no, we want to protect the heirloom seeds that we have, and we want to perpetuate those stocks. And so, for example, I have there's going to be a study abroad in Brazil, if anybody's interested. We'll be doing a study abroad in Brazil. It's an international environmental sociology course. We'll be addressing agroecology. It's for 3 weeks in May. But working with those folks there's a significant effort to do seed saving and protect from those kinds of contaminants that are happening. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I was also talking about like farmers who grow traditional corn.
So you can easily check. There's been a long-running court case about this, about a farmer that was not growing GM corn, but his neighbors were, and essentially he tried to create he went forward with a lawsuit saying that his seed stocks had been contaminated and his products had been contaminated. And then the company went ahead and sued him for stealing their genetic material. So yeah, you can look that up online. I'm not going to go there too much, but yeah, you can certainly find that case. It's been a long-running case, and he's talked all over the country about his experiences with that.
And on the topic of genetic contamination, so if U.S. is going forward with growing more and more GMO crops, and more that contamination happens, will we in the future have no crops that are not genetically modified because of the contamination?
So the question is, if we keep genetically modifying more and more crops, we'll eventually have plants that are not genetically, will we run out of plants that are not genetically modified? I'd say no, because there is a lot of interest in heirloom varieties, and but then for certain crops like soybeans in the United States, maybe, except for organic producers. If you're raising organic crops, you can't use GMOs, and so you'd have to.
How do you protect your crop if you're one of
Oh, okay. Well, one thing to consider is that the problem of genetic contamination, it isn't just with GMOs, it's with any variety. Let me give you an example. So this is a blue corn I grew in my garden. If I plant the seeds from this corn, chances are it might produce blue corn, but it might not, because it was planted right beside this one. And these aren't GMOs at all. And most farmers, at least big non-organic farmers, for a long time now, except for some things like soybeans, they mainly don't keep their own seed. They're mainly buying seed from companies, and those companies are out raising that seed in places where it can't be contaminated. And so they would have the same problem with genetic contamination 20 years ago, 40 years ago, that we would have with GM crops today. They're just different genes, and so that contamination isn't just relevant to GM crops.
Has the U.S. government, or does it address the fact that there could be a Irish potato famine type situation, or is that just not on the U.S. government or the business's radar? I mean, I don't know how relevant that is or not. That's what I'm asking.
No, it's certainly very relevant. So the question there was, if you know about the Irish potato famine, 1845, is that right? I don't have Google here with me. But it was a case where one fungus basically destroyed all of Ireland's potatoes, and lots of people starved. And it was able to destroy all the potatoes because most of the potatoes were clones. They were the exact same, they had the same DNA. And so if we're planting basically the same crops over and over here, could we have that same problem? And is the government worried about it? Yes, certainly. But this may sound strange to say, but I think the seed companies are even more worried about it, because say we have this thing we call Roundup Ready soybeans, that the soybean you can go and apply Roundup to and it doesn't hurt it. There's really no such thing as one Roundup Ready soybean. There's a type of Roundup Ready soybean that grows well in Texas, and a type that grows well in South Carolina, and a type that grows well in Nebraska. And they have different genes because the plants with the Roundup Ready genes have been crossed with soybeans that grew well in that area. So there's probably not near as much crop homogeneity as we tend to think when we just label something a genetically modified crop. But yeah, a lot of people are worried about it. Yes, sir.
So economics come into this discussion all the time because of the big corporations, but what are your thoughts on the alternative to GMOs, corporate influence And I don't think that that's an economic, I think that's an economic reality that people just see that as a value that they're willing to pay more for.
Right. You and me.
It's a tough one.
How do we, okay, so your question was, we certainly, with genetically modified crops, we have lots of powerful companies involved. And you were saying, well, also on the non-GMO side, there's lots of money and propaganda too as well. And you mentioned the non-GMO water. Is this the raw water?
Yeah.
Okay, but it's a non-GMO water. And of course, I don't think water has DNA. It doesn't replicate, right? Was there really a non-GMO water? Huh.
They sell the sprouts.
So
Yeah.
we talk about
Do they really?
So we talk about greenwashing. You've heard this, right? And so maybe that's a form of
Yeah.
non-GMO washing. I don't know. We can create a new.
Yeah.
Let's come up with a new term for this. But it's certainly interesting because it appeals to particular consumer concerns, right? And so that's something that maybe we all need to think about as consumers too. Is sort of how do we be critical in our patterns, in our buying patterns.
And maybe soon they'll come up with a non-GMO Tide Pod for us to eat as well, right?
Yeah. There's your mic drop.
Yes, sir.
I was wondering if there is a way you can tell by simply looking at the conserved fruit if it's genetically modified or not, if you know that.
What kind of fruit?
If you can tell if it's GMO by looking at it, is that what you're saying? Okay, so the degree of certainty is probably a little questionable, but if you cut it open and you look inside of the raw fruit, it's supposed to be more yellow than a non-GMO fruit, because the yellow is the vitamin A that's in it. So perhaps that's one way. And you know when you cook it, it becomes more yellow, right? But it's before it's cooked, you can see. And my guess there is even though they're doing field trials, it will have to be labeled in some way, right? And it could be that there could be cost differentials between the original, like the heirloom variety of banana and the GMO banana. Does that answer your question?
Last question.
Well, let's get one over here. We've kind of been ignoring that side, so.
Do we have any studies or long-term studies about how eating genetically modified foods affects people over a long period of time? So say I go eat that algae burger and it's all I eat for 5 years. How does that affect human thought?
So the question there, has there been any long-term studies of how a genetically modified food affects someone's health, affects people's health? There can't be a study really exactly like that, because it'd really be hard to have a control and then a treatment. You know, like maybe if they made everybody on a college campus consume the GMO banana, and not people at University of Oklahoma consume the GMO banana, then maybe we'd have a split that we could tell. So no, there's been nothing like that. But one of the main reasons is that scientists don't really see any need to have a study like that. Because, like, suppose we did that study because we had this new GM crop with some different genes in it. But then suppose we have there's new crop varieties coming out all the time that aren't GMOs. And they have different genes. How do we assess those as well? So usually what the USDA does is when a company makes and the FDA, when a company makes a GMO crop, they have to submit paperwork about how the DNA have changed, the new proteins that it's producing. And if they think there's a cause for concern, then I'll give you an example. There was they wanted to take soybeans, which is an incomplete protein, and add a gene from the Brazilian nut to make it a complete protein, so it would be more healthy for livestock. But they discovered in the process that by putting those Brazilian nut genes in the soybean gene, it made a protein that resembles peanuts. And so they did some studies and they found that if you're allergic to peanuts and you ate that soybean, you might have an allergic reaction. And so they nixed that whole thing. And so when they have reasons, they'll really do intensive studies, but if they don't really see a really good reason, they don't do any.
Thank you, everyone.
Please join me in
Thank you. Great
thanking our
questions.
speakers.
Thank you so much for the questions.